What's up, good people? This is Roots and Reason, and I'm back with another video. Man, I'm so excited. This one's going to be a good one because we're going to be talking about football. I'm a football fan. If you're a football fan, you're going to love this one because we're going to talk about it. Now, we're going to be continuing with our series on who gets to be an African. And I wanted to start off by talking about the recent Ballon d'Or ceremony. Now, Usman Dembele was crowned the Ballon d'Or winner. The last Ballon d'Or winner was George Weah of Liberia. But much of the discourse around Usman Dembele winning it centered around Mohamed Salah and whether he's perceived as being African enough in order for him to be crowned a worthy winner. Now, a lot of the discourse centered around whether Mohamed Salah is seen as being African just based on the fact that he is not black. And one particular post made mention of the fact that Usman is seen as being more African, even though he is French, than Mohamed Salah, who was born and bred in Egypt. Now, I wanted to talk about this in a bit more detail, so please stick around, like, share, and subscribe, and we're going to break it down.
We have to go to the root. We have to go to the cause. Dealing with the condition itself is not enough.
Now, there is a historical discourse that has taken place or that has not taken place between Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. This is down to this topic of Africanness and who can be called African. Now, the discourse has not taken place largely due to the fact that the relationship has always been strained between Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa.
Is that when I say it wasn't necessarily the motherland experience, I remember going there and them saying, "Are you from Africa?" And I was thinking, like, you literally live here, but are asking me if I'm from Africa, which I don't mind. But I just noticed there was like maybe some separation or distancing of themselves. I felt like some of the people, they wanted to identify more with like Middle East than
Exactly.
necessarily identifying with the continent, which was confusing to me.
Now, Sub-Saharan Africa is seen as being one particular block because it's a group of black people who all trace to different ethnicities and tribes, while North Africa has a number of people who largely share the same facial features and racial features as well, but can be more tied to Arabic nations. Now, the Arabic nations, as we will know, and anyone who is a student of history will realize that the Arabic nations were part of the Arabic slave trade, and this ended up resulting in the North African countries being occupied. Now, the North African countries of Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, and Egypt were occupied, and the end result being that there was a intermixing or racial mixing between the black populations of those countries and the Arabic settlers who settled in those countries. And what we have in this day and age now are people who largely trace themselves, who partly trace themselves back to the continent, and the other part trace themselves to the Arabic settlers. Now, the relationship between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa has always been strained, and it has been strained due to the fact that the North African nations are seen as aligning more with the Arabic nations and Europe, as opposed to those who they are directly connected to the same continent with. Now, this is underlined by the fact that Morocco attempted to join the European Union back in 1987, but were rejected. And since then, and not just since then, but before then and even after then, there's always seemed to be an othering of some shape or form. Now, back in 2022, Morocco reached the semifinals of the World Cup. And along that time, the entire continent was celebrating and the world was celebrating what was deemed as the first African country to make it into the World Cup semifinals. But the problem that came was that a lot of the discourse came around a few posts which were made on social media by people who are connected to the Moroccan national team. I think one of them being Ashraf Hakimi. Forgive me if I get this wrong. But the post seemed to acknowledge the role that the Arabic nations had played. The post seemed to acknowledged the wider respect to the nation of Morocco, but very little was made of the fact that this was going to be seen as a victory for Africa and for African football. Now, I recognize and I understand that African football and the topic of African football is very complicated, right? Because when you look at African football and African FAs in particular, there are a number of different inconsistencies there. You know, there are tales of corruption, tales of malfeasance, tales of abuse of funds. While North African countries tend to take their football a lot more seriously and are a lot more organized when it comes to their footballing issues and their footballing facilities. Now, all of this aside, there is a divide that occurs between North African countries and Sub-Saharan African countries. And this extends beyond the football landscape. This is largely due to the fact that culturally, North Africans are seen as being distinct and separate from Sub-Saharan Africans. North Africans are seen as being racially different from Sub-Saharan Africans. North African countries almost are perceived as being special in the fact that they align themselves more with Middle Eastern nations, and this is found in organizations such as MENA, which is the Middle East and North African Organization, but also by the fact that North Africa is quite close to Europe. And so there is a little bit of, because due to the proximity of Europeanness, North Africa almost sees itself as being more aligned with the countries that it is close to, as opposed to the countries that it is connected to the same continent with. Now, this is a problem because when it comes to football, it is largely seen that North African countries are deemed as being separate. And so a victory for them isn't necessarily seen as a victory for Africa from the Sub-Saharan perspective. But on the other hand, because they are connected to us and there has been an intermixing that has occurred, that they should become part of us. Now, this is a deeply complex topic, one of which I can't get into the full details about. But when we're talking about who gets to be an African, this is one of the areas that we have to look at. Because in the last video, I mentioned about ethnicity. In the last video, I mentioned about Black people who can trace themselves back to the tribes that are connected to the land of Africa. But what more of those who have become a product of intermixing between ancient ethnic groups and Arabic settlers, or those who trace themselves more towards the Arabic settlers? Who gets to be an African? Let me know what your thoughts are. Please like, share, and subscribe. Like I mentioned, this is a very complex topic, and this is one that we won't even be able to settle today. However, this will be one for us to continue the discourse around. And so please comment, please let me know what your thoughts are, and let's keep the discourse going. Peace.